Milwaukee is burning, and it should come as no surprise to anyone. With a coon gas bag like David the Coon Clark as sheriff, and an open Klansman like Edward Flynn as police chief of Milwaukee City, who never saw an act of police violence that they didn't like, what else do you expect? Inflammatory white supremacists like these are in charge of law enforcement in Milwaukee, and what we see is that, as with everything else, the white supremacists have destroyed whatever legitimacy the police in Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin, for that matter, might have had. As I've told you countless times before, when the police lose their legitimacy, they have also lost their ability to expect the public to follow any laws at all. Law enforcement doesn't begin with any badge-wearing, gun-toting thugs calling themselves police. It begins with the public themselves. Police can only enforce the law to the extent that the public allows them to. But that only works so long as the public sees the laws and those who enforce them as impartial and just. The police cannot make law and order, but should they become corrupt, as they clearly have, they can certainly tear law and order down. When it comes to people who need to obey the law, the police are the first ones who need to follow that advice. The white supremacist race soldiers who have taken over the police in Milwaukee have been allowed to run wild for decades. In the 1960s, they would be allowed to brutalize citizens under racist thugs like former Milwaukee Police Chief Harold Breyer. During anti-police violence protests in the 60s, Breyer would instruct officers to remove their badges when they surveilled protesters. This way, when they attacked the protesters, it would be impossible to positively identify a race soldier because there was no name tag or badge number. Many have claimed that the Milwaukee police are up to their old tricks during the recent Black Lives Matter rallies this year as well. The FBI issued a report in 2006 that raised the alarm to the fact that white supremacists had wholesale infiltrated American law enforcement, and in conjunction with racist politicians such as the DAs and local judges, were using the cover of law to carry out their race war against black citizens. These white supremacist trash have trampled the law and the rights of citizens for decades. And rather than prosecute race soldiers posing as police, instead the cops and prosecutors have either lied through their teeth and claimed there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, or, as in the case of David Clark, they flat out praised the race soldiers for their latest white trash terrorist attack. This blatant and open racial tyranny on the part of those who swore to uphold the law has destroyed the necessary legitimacy police and DAs must have in order to be effective in maintaining obedience to the law. But they have been the worst and most egregious violators of the law, and everyone can see it. We won't get into how Milwaukee is one of the most openly segregated cities in America, or that the unemployment rate for African Americans in the state of Wisconsin is the highest in the entire nation, twice the national average. Things are so bad that Wisconsin has been named the worst state in America for African Americans to live in. This is the environment, the place that created a twisted animal like David Clark. The more harsh the oppression, the more odious and sick-minded the self-hatred of turncoats like Clark. So, after decades and decades of white lawlessness, Milwaukee has exploded in anger. Now, if you're a Fox News viewer, this event took you completely by surprise, as pretty much everything else on Earth does. Let that be a lesson to the brain-dead morons who watch Fox and spew their moronic talking points. Just because you ignore reality won't make it go away. Here's 5 facts about the Milwaukee uprising that the white media isn't telling you. First, don't call it riots. Most white people breeze through life pretty easily, so small things like grammar don't matter to them. What happened in Milwaukee is not a riot, but rather an uprising. The people clearly understand themselves to be under relentless assault by white race soldiers posting as police. They've demanded for decades that the local and state government step in to root out these white race terrorists and punish them. The local governments have declared themselves the administrative arm of the race soldiers, so the public is now fighting back on their own. This is not and can never be a riot. White people need to get that through their thick skulls. Riots are what white people do. Usually after Duke wins a basketball game, or after the Red Wings lose a hockey game, or during a freaking pumpkin festival. Second, to the extent that it was allegedly a riot, there's only been one. The burning of a gas station was a single event, not a multiple event. So to call it riots is a lie, but then again, we have the white media stirring the pot and brain-dead morons in the dominant society who eat this stuff up. These morons think that mischaracterizing an uprising or the public backlash against police violence is somehow a win for them. They still don't get it, and never will. Every time they cover for a race soldier terrorist attack, they prove themselves to be racists. Every time a race soldier's crimes go unpunished, that is a loss for them. The public will only take so many attacks before they eventually push back, and hard. Second, Milwaukee is fighting an open race war against black citizens. You didn't have to sit and wait until last weekend to know that Milwaukee has been a cauldron of white supremacist racism. As if the half-cocked asinine rantings of Sheriff Coon wasn't enough proof, on the few occasions that those in the white media have bothered to actually look, the racial picture in Milwaukee is as bad as anything you'll find anywhere in America. Worse, in fact. Although blacks are 40% of Milwaukee's population, you wouldn't know it looking at their city council, the ethnic makeup of the police department, or the business owners. According to Salon.com, Milwaukee is actually worse than Ferguson, and that's just in terms of the police's anti-black violence. When you look at the state of Wisconsin in general, you understand the entire state has become a reeking cesspool of white supremacy. In 2014, Dontre Hamilton was murdered by a white race soldier. Hamilton had been sleeping in the park, and although two other police officers who had spoken to him that day concluded that he wasn't a threat to anyone, white race terrorist Christopher Manny ambushed Hamilton, shooting him 14 times. Forensics found that half the bullets that killed Hamilton traveled in a downward direction before striking him. That means he was already on the ground. No gunpowder residue on Hamilton's corpse, which proves that the murderer fired from a distance. There were no drugs or alcohol in Hamilton's system, so the old "he was on drugs" lie can't be used, nor can any lies about he was trying to grab the race killer's gun. This probably sounds a lot like the murder of Laquan McDonald, doesn't it? At no time did Hamilton violate any of Ed Flynn's so-called rules, and the Milwaukee police still murdered him anyway. And the Milwaukee DA decided to betray the public and flatly refused to prosecute. And this isn't the only time they've done it. In the last 18 months alone, a dozen civil cases have been filed against the Milwaukee police and Milwaukee City. To give you a snapshot of the kind of racist organization Edward Flynn runs, the lawsuits detail 70 illegal strip searches between 2007 and 2012. All of the victims were black men. One suspect was forced to defecate into a cardboard box, allegedly to force him to give up drugs the police claimed that he was hiding in his anal cavity. Of course, no drugs were found. And one of the white race thugs who carried out these crimes is now serving a 26-month prison sentence for 4 felonies and 4 misdemeanors. Yet another white male who gets hit with tons of charges, but does practically no time. All this happened in David Clark's Milwaukee County and in Edward Flynn's Milwaukee Police Department. Think about that the next time you see David Clark claiming that there's no police brutality and no police racism. Next time you see some white trolls attempting to praise Edward Flynn, you remind them of the kind of police department that he runs. And none of this is new. Way back in 2003, Curtis Harris was paralyzed from the neck down after a Milwaukee police white supremacist thug named Kevin Clark attacked him in a police station. The city wound up having to pay out $3 million for that white race terrorist attack. Not that it will do Curtis Harris any good. The next year, Frank Jude Jr. was brutally attacked by two white race soldiers in the Milwaukee police. One of the white thugs claimed that Jude had tried to steal his wallet. In 2011, Derek Williams was arrested by Milwaukee police. He had acute sickle cell anemia, and although he begged for help and for the police to call him an ambulance, the white race terrorist ignored him. He died in the back of a police car. Squad car video caught all this, including how the white race terrorists were mocking him as he died. The medical examiner ruled the crime a homicide. An inquest jury found cause to charge the race soldiers with failure to render aid, but the so-called special prosecutor said that there wasn't enough evidence to go to trial. When it comes to targeting black people, Wisconsin leads the nation, and these attacks on black people start literally from the day they're born. For example, Wisconsin's high school suspension rate for black students is the highest in America. Higher than Illinois, higher than Louisiana, higher than Texas. Fully 34% of black students in Wisconsin have been suspended, compared to only 4% of white students. So let me get this straight. White kids are coming to school shooting up homeroom. The white teachers are sleeping with underage students. But it's the black students who are seen as the problem? Only under white supremacy can such a perversion be possible. And in David Clark's Milwaukee County, the situation is far worse. Milwaukee public school suspension rate is 33%. That's 3 times the national average. And you won't be surprised to learn who's the main group being targeted. 43% of black students were suspended in the 2011-2012 school year alone. You don't get numbers like these unless you have a deliberate, organized, planned effort by white teachers to punish black students simply because they showed up for class. However, as badly as black children are treated in Wisconsin, it's when you look at the prison system in that state that you see why David Clark and Edward Flins feel so emboldened to openly defend white supremacists in the police. According to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee's Unemployment and Training Institute's 2013 Mass Incarceration of African American Males study, David Clark's Milwaukee Sheriff's Office has been incarcerating black males in particular at epidemic rates. And that over half of black men in their 30s and 40s have been incarcerated in Wisconsin over the course of the last 20 years. So, if you're a black man between the ages of 30 and 50 in Wisconsin, there's a 50% chance the race soldiers in the police and the DA's office will try to find a reason to put you behind bars. This is why Wisconsin has the highest incarceration rate for black men in the entire United States. I want you to let that sink in. Wisconsin has the highest incarceration rate for black men in all of the United States of America. Now, I'll bet you didn't know that before just now, did you? Think of whatever state you previously thought had the worst record for locking up black men, whether it's Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, Texas, or California. Well, Wisconsin's incarceration rate for black men beats all of them by a country mile. And just in case anyone wants to debate whether it's racially targeted, consider this. As I pointed out to you from the FBI's own 2014 Crime in the U.S. report, white people are only 60% of the population, but 83% of DUIs in America. In fact, whites are 80% of all alcohol intoxication crimes in the U.S. More people die from alcohol-related accidents and violence than drugs, yet whites are only 35% of the prison population nationwide. In Wisconsin, blacks are 6% of the population, yet are 67% of inmates behind bars for drug convictions. And as the report states, this is directly due to the policies from the 1990s. There's no way that 6% of the population can be nearly 70% of drug arrests when it's a proven fact that blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate. In fact, Time magazine reported in 2011 that whites are actually more likely to abuse drugs than black people. And the ACLU performed a study where they found that while black and white drug use was almost exactly the same, the number of blacks arrested for marijuana possession was more than 10 to 1 in some counties. Wisconsin spends more on its prison system than it does on its university system, which tells you precisely where its priorities are at. Well, no wonder David Kuhn is so eager to give police a pass for their racism. If the Justice Department ever decided to come down to Milwaukee and do a real investigation of his sheriff's office, he would most likely wind up indicted. And as the black police who have been accused of harming white people have found out, when a black cop gets indicted, he's on his own. As are the black residents of Milwaukee, whose government has been waging an organized and sustained race war upon them, with the white police pretending to be cops as foot soldiers. And make no mistake, the thugs hiding behind badges in Milwaukee are not police. A child molester who goes to work for the Boy Scouts isn't a Boy Scout counselor. He's a child molester pretending to be a Boy Scout counselor. A member of ISIS who joins the Iraqi army is not a soldier. He's a terrorist pretending to be a soldier. And a white supremacist who joins the sheriff's department or police department is not a police officer. He's a white supremacist pretending to be a police officer. Doesn't matter what the state says your occupation is, it doesn't change what you are. Now you would think that with these kinds of stats and the way David Clark talks about the black youth in the county that he allegedly serves, that David Clark would be embarrassed about all this. After all, doesn't the youth respect David Clark? Don't they look at him and see someone who they would like to emulate, a role model for a law-abiding citizen? That is, if your idea of law-abiding is to kill handcuffed people, or if your idea of community policing is a thug sheriff who calls the public scum and trash, and who celebrates when killer cops are allowed to walk by a racist and corrupt DA's office. Oh wait, the public is taking their cues directly from thugs like David Clark now that I think about it. I think we're finally starting to understand the root cause of some of these problems after all. Speaking of which, 3. Coons can't protect anyone, not even themselves. The walls are clearly closing in on the white supremacists and their mascots like David Clark. The verbal diarrhea that clowns like him and Edward Flynn spout may play on Fox News, but it doesn't play anywhere else. In fact, it doesn't even play in Milwaukee, because Milwaukee's own Journal-Sentinel published a scathing editorial about David Clark just last year, questioning his ability to tell the truth and his basic grasp on sanity. No reason to question his integrity, though, because he never had any to begin with. It's slowly starting to dawn on David Clark and his white masters that they're losing their war with reality. And as a result, they're trying to barricade themselves behind a wall of lies and absurd fantasies. It's the last refuge of the race soldier who's been run to ground. David Clark claimed that police brutality and racism had ended in the 60s, when even his own white neighbors in Milwaukee said plainly that that was a lie. He claimed that there was a Harvard study that showed that there was no racism in the hearts of police officers. If you hadn't heard of this alleged Harvard study, you're not alone because nobody else has either. In fact, even Harvard never heard of this phantom study. At last count, Harvard's own Public Affairs and Communications Office was trying to find this fictitious study that they had allegedly conducted. They're still looking for it. And when people asked Clark for the source of this alleged Harvard study, Clark decided to hide behind one of his police spokeswomen and told her to simply say to contact Harvard. Needless to say, the bastard has never repeated this lie since. This is typical of white supremacists. They constantly run around spouting made-up stats, phony studies that don't exist. This is white supremacy's entire MO. To get the lie out there, to tell a lie 1,000,000 times and then run away when questioned. Their job is to spread lies and nothing else. So if it seems like it's easy to make them look stupid in a debate, that's because their goal isn't to win a debate. It's simply to forward one lying talking point after the other. They can't defend their rhetoric because it was never meant to be defended in the first place. It was only meant to be repeated. This is why they depend upon their allies in broadcast media. White media is a safe space for white supremacists, a fact-free zone where reality is never allowed to intrude. I debunked the Blue Lives Matter talking points on my own channel, proving that policing is among the safest professions in America. And who's one of the main liars you see on TV constantly claiming that being a police officer is so dangerous? David the Coon Clark. The other moron in the Milwaukee police is Ed Flynn, the police chief there. Ever since Ferguson, he's made it a point to defend police racism every chance he's gotten. He's got some press for some ignorant gibberish he spouted last year about 4 rules not to get shot in Milwaukee. Naturally, he never references Dontre Hamilton whenever he spouts these lies. In fact, he made himself so obnoxious with his behavior that even the white members of the Milwaukee City Council rebuked him for it, and he was later forced to have to retire his so-called rules. As usual, race soldiers like Edward Flynn never admit that police violence even exists, and no one really holds them to account for it. But that's not to say these clowns are winning. Quite the opposite. The police have lost all legitimacy in America, so the public will not follow any laws because they realize the ones who are supposed to enforce the laws are the biggest criminals in town. And now they're complaining because no one takes them seriously. Too late for that now. David Clark and Edward Flynn have openly vilified the victims of police murder, applauded race soldiers who assault, maim, and kill people at random. They encourage lawlessness by cheering those who are allegedly sworn to uphold the law in their daily crimes against that very law. There's been a breakdown in law and order in Milwaukee, all right, but it wasn't in the streets. It's been in the police departments and sheriff's offices of David Clark and Edward Flynn. It's been in the prosecutor's offices and judges' chambers. When the federal government passed the 14th Amendment and took slavery from being a private sector institution to a public sector one. And we all know it. 4. The white media is fanning the flames. It's bad enough that the police in Milwaukee are run through with white supremacist trash, but so is the white media. They've spent years, which amount to decades, excusing race soldier violence under color of law. The white media clearly understands the place that they occupy under white supremacy, and that is to be its propaganda arm. They also understand the police are the enforcement arm of white supremacy. You saw what happened in Minnesota when those 3 white boys called themselves playing race soldiers. They got their asses stomped. Same for the Klan in Sacramento. They were literally beaten out of town. White males know this, that if they actually ever were dumb enough to call themselves trying to fight an open race war against black people, they would lose in short order. They may have us outnumbered, but we've clearly got them outclassed, and they know it. This is why they're so desperate to prop up the race soldiers and the police. This is the only card they've got. Without their race soldiers and law enforcement, they would lose whatever little power they imagine themselves to have. As they see the police being exposed and disgraced, as they see the public turning against the race soldiers who are hiding in law enforcement, as they see the police incompetently isolating themselves, the pale males are starting to get nervous. Open warfare against the black population would be suicide for them. In war, the army who's angrier tends to win. And blacks are extremely angry right now. It's only our own apathy and confusion that keeps more uprisings from happening. As I've told you before, a large number of white people in the media have been in law enforcement, such as John Miller of ABC News, who's been a press liaison for the NYPD, LAPD, and even the FBI. Look at your own local police and sheriff's departments, and you'll see many former news people who are now walking around as cops. And many police officers who have gone into media themselves. Fox News' Bo Dietl is a former NYPD thug. David Simon, creator of HBO's The Wire, had a writing partner, Edward Burns, who was himself a former Baltimore narcotics officer. The ties between the police and the white media are incestuous. There has long been a revolving door between your local police station and news station. And it's not until you actually do a head count of who in the media is a police stooge that you realize how deep this cancer runs. Ever wonder why every time the police murder someone, the white media treats the police as the victims and the victims as suspects? Why the white media never reports the often voluminous bad conduct records police officers have? Why the white media never asks police tough questions, like how many black people their departments have murdered this year alone? The white media has been a shameless group of whores prostituting themselves to the thugs in blue, because they're one and the same. And by constantly putting a spin on police violence, the white media has put more and more strain on the public's willingness to do nothing. And as we've seen, that willingness has now broken. The white media's job is to control the public, control their spending habits, their opinions, their interests, but most of all to control the public outrage, so that it only gets vented in directions away from those in power. At this point, people don't even realize who's oppressing them, and that proves the media succeeded in its mission to protect entrenched power. They can act safely from behind a wall of anonymity. But as the public makes pushing back against race soldiers in the police a priority, the police's colleagues in the media realize that this isn't going away. The white media can smear the victims all they want. The only thing it does is make the media look biased. They can call themselves impartial, but no one else does. They've painted themselves into a corner. Either go after the race soldiers, that is to say their friends and themselves, or become as illegitimate as the police have become. Because the white media think that they can come up with enough reality TV shows to avert this, but they can't. The white media's true power has always laid in their ability to mislead the public, either through glittering distractions, such as entertainment shows, or through misinformation and misdirection through so-called news, which we all recognize as white propaganda. The fact that the white media wasn't able to contain this latest explosion of public outrage with police violence, or to even see this one coming, proves that they're useless as far as public information goes. The white media thinks of themselves as trend setters. But when the trend is public disgust with race soldiers and the police, all of a sudden the white media is deaf, dumb, and blind. Well, no one needs or wants a news media that doesn't tell them anything new. The white media seems to be the last ones to know that they've made themselves the epitome of irrelevant. And 5. The fifth and most important thing that the white media is not going to tell you about the Milwaukee uprising is that we've got the race soldiers on the defensive. Sun Tzu once said that to start off as aggressive and belligerent and then wind up cowering under a table is the height of incompetence. That sums up David Clarke perfectly. He was very bold talking about his so-called Harvard study, but when people confronted him about it, he went scurrying behind the skirt of one of his sheriff spokeswomen. The fact that that coon had to beg the National Guard to come in and save his bacon proves that he can't even do his job, and all of his on-air TV bluster was just a con. And while his pals in the white media are trying their damnedest to put a pretty face on it, even they can tell Sheriff Motormouth looks like a scared little boy begging the adults to come in and save him. It's clear to everyone that David Clarke is helpless and desperate, peeing his pants at the sight of a few kids who set fire to a gas station. So much for the wannabe Black John Wayne. Now, if this moron is paralyzed with fear at a mere gas station getting torched, what will this moron do when something really bad happens? There weren't hundreds of people involved in this property destruction. It was only a dozen or so. The rest were merely bystanders. But it does go to show the white supremacists are full of talk. They talk big about what they would do if black people ever crossed them, like the white boys in Minnesota did, but when the deal goes down, they wind up running. As I told you weeks ago, it's going to be a long, hot summer, and it ain't over yet. David Coon probably figured his tough talk on Fox would make him feared. All he did was to dare the black residents to challenge him, which they have. And he's shown everyone that his city has gone up in flames, just like Baltimore, and all he can do is sit helplessly and watch. And I can tell that his white supremacist cheerleaders are becoming ever so disgusted by his weakness. They may be trying to run interference for him, but they're still disgusted at the fact that their chosen coon can't keep the Negroes in line. 3 nights straight, Milwaukee has been on fire, and David Coon and Edward Flynn have been reduced to the weak, pathetic, empty suits that they've always been. And on a side note, there's been some loose talk about protesters allegedly dragging white people from their cars. Well, that's all bunk. Grainy video with disembodied voices screaming anonymous things. That all smells of a hoax to me. Yep. I think the whole attacks on white people thing is nothing more than a Fox News hoax, a ploy to divide people along lines of race. And as usual, white people are falling for it. Frankly, I need to see more evidence before I even begin to believe any such claims. Hell, even if the claims were true, and that's a very big if, personally, I would call it self-defense. Some of those people were clearly trying to hit those black protesters with their cars. The white media and white people on the internet need to wait for all the facts to come out instead of running off half-cocked like they always do. So before you let anyone claim that white people are being attacked in Milwaukee, you demand that they provide you with the names of any of these black attackers or any of these white victims. When white supremacy decides that they're going to turn the victims into the perpetrators and the perpetrators into the victims, they need to be challenged. The people in Milwaukee are reacting to decades of white police racial violence. No amount of smearing the victims can conceal that. The white media's efforts to trash the victims and defame the deceased who cannot speak for themselves has backfired. And the police's efforts to use white supremacist surrogates in the official media and online to spread their lies has also backfired. White supremacy is a con, and the police, as its enforcement arm, have become an extension of that lie. And reality will always defeat lies. That's what's happening here. The police and media thought if they just told everyone that everybody loves the cops, then the public would mindlessly go along with it. Instead, the opposite has happened. As black citizens rise up, the dominant society is now being forced to come to terms with the reality. If you want the unrest to stop, then you must first stop the cause of it. White race soldiers in the police, the DA's offices, and the white media must be rooted out and punished. And that doesn't mean 26 months in jail. It means serious, hard decades behind bars. Both David Clarke and Edward Flynn must be investigated, tried for official corruption, both in how they personally handled their offices and in how they created the atmosphere of lawlessness that's brought about so much unrest. The rotten trash heap that is the police in Milwaukee County and City falls squarely on their shoulders. They are the cause of all this, and justice cannot be deemed as having been done until they are in prison. Neither the white media nor their buffoonish allies online can wish this one away. There's no denying David Clarke got his balls cut off by a bunch of kids in the streets. And as I predicted, if the police were not punished for their violence, if the white media continued to antagonize the public by smearing those who are murdered by the police, then this summer would get very hot indeed. And it's happened in David Clarke's own home. So not even the tough talkers of white supremacy can conceal themselves from the public outrage. And as long as the police continue to murder citizens, as long as the DAs refuse to prosecute them for it, and the media continues to run interference for them, then we will see this happen again and again in more cities.